Okay, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us for our conversation today with extraordinary scholars Jessica Marie Johnson, Sasha Turner Bryson, and Sharon Block. I am literally waiting. I was just waiting with bated breath to be in conversation with these wonderful scholars. I am Deirdre Cooper Owens. I'm the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia. The Library Company of Philadelphia was founded in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin, and the program in African American history is the anchor program, I'm proud to say, of this cultural institution. I'm now going to ask my panelists to cut on their camera so they can see your faces. And I also want to, as they're doing that, I want to thank my colleagues, Jasmine Smith, who is the archivist of early African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia. We literally work hand in hand. And also Ms. Deja Brock, who is our events coordinator, but also helps on the technical side as well. Before we begin our talk, if you have questions or comments, I ask that you use the Q&A feature. If that's too difficult, you can always put it in the chat, and I'll do my best to read the questions and or comments to our panelists. So with that said, let me just give one more shout out to Dr. Michael Bersanti, who is the director of the Library Company, to all of our archivists and colleagues, and to wish you all a very happy Black History Month. And now I'm going to read the bios of my colleagues. So I'll start first with Sharon Block, whose work I can honestly say it has informed every last person on this panel. She is an amazing scholar, has done some really groundbreaking research. Professor Block is a professor of history at the University of California, Irvine, and currently a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. She works in colonial North American history with specializations in history of sexuality, race, and the body, as well as digital humanities more broadly. She is the author of Rape and Sexual Power in Early America. It came out from UNC Press, so that's the University of North Carolina Press, in 2006. And most recently published Colonial Complexions, Race and Bodies in 18th Century America. It came out in 2018 through the University of Pennsylvania Press. And Professor Block is a co-editor of Major Problems in American Women's History. As an early advocate for digital humanities, she was the first historian to use topic modeling for historical analysis, including to show the unfortunately small footprint of women's history in publications. Most recently, she has published an article in Digital Humanities Quarterly on racist and sexist algorithms in a scholarly database. And finally, Sharon has held far too many administrative positions for her own good, so welcome. Next, we have Sasha Turner, who is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Turner writes widely on topics relating to the social and cultural history of the Caribbean, including her recent book, Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Child Rearing, and Slavery in Jamaica. Her work has appeared in academic journals such as Slavery and Abolition and the Journal of Women's History, and on popular platforms such as Black Perspectives. Professor Turner has received many awards for her work, including from the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, the Southern Association of Women Historians, the African American Intellectual History Society, Association of Black Women Historians, and North American Conference on British Studies. Professor Turner is working on a new project on slavery and emotions. And our featured speaker today is Jessica Marie Johnson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She and Professor Turner are in fact in the same department there. Professor Johnson is a historian of Atlantic slavery and the Atlantic African diaspora. She is the author of the book we're going to discuss today, Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World. It was published in August 2020 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. She is also co-editor with Lauren Tilton and David Mimo of Debates in the Digital Humanities, Computational Humanities, and a guest editor of Slavery and the Machine, a special issue of Archipelago's Journal, and co-editor with Dr. Mark Anthony Neal of Duke University of Black Code, a special issue of the Black Scholar. I welcome all of you. I am going to first ask that Professor Johnson just lay a kind of framing for us to think about her new book, Wicked Flesh. And also in the chat, you'll notice that we will put links to where you can purchase these books. And I'll also include one of 125 Black-owned bookstores for you to purchase that book as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper Owens, for that introduction. And thank you so much for having me here. I was a fellow at the Library Company in this program of African American history, and is where I was able to bring a lot of the thoughts for this book together. So this is very much something of a homecoming for me, and it's exciting to be here with everybody to talk about this work. So just a little bit, and I won't talk long because I'm looking forward to the conversation, a little bit about the book, Wicked Flesh, Black Women, Intimacy, and Freedom in the Atlantic World, is a book that is about the ways that African women and women of African descent moved across the Atlantic to the New World. It looks at a specific Atlantic diaspora space in which that's very much connected to New Orleans. In this context, I talk about it as New Orleans, Atlantic world. And it moves from Senegambia through and around the Caribbean and ends up in New Orleans, where African women, as well as African men and children, help create the city that we know and love and admire so well. That actually just finished with a Mardi Gras that was sort of canceled, but if anybody is in New Orleans or knows New Orleans, they were doing floats on their houses so that you could still sort of celebrate the Mardi Gras season. So we're just past Mardi Gras today on this Lenten Wednesday.
I'm so sorry, Professor Johnson, if you could just move to your mic a little closer. I'm getting a number of messages that people can't hear you. I apologize for interrupting.
Oh, I'm so sorry. How does it sound now? Better?
Much
Oh,
better.
that sounds better. Great. Yes, and feel free to stop me anytime, and I can just keep pushing that and fixing it. Okay, so it's a look at New Orleans, Atlantic world. Let's look at the ways that African women and women of African descent are creating different kinds of freedom in this world in a moment in which freedom is quite truncated for people of African descent. Slavery is expanding. The 18th century is this moment where slavery is becoming increasingly tied to servitude, increasingly tied to chattel. It's a moment in which the boundaries between European and African, white and Black, men and women, gender binaries, these are all becoming codified in the French Atlantic world. And so in a lot of ways, when we've thought about this moment, we've thought about freedom in the context of the Manumission Act and freedom in the context of later on the Emancipation decrees. But I was really interested about in the ways that African women and women of African descent are maximizing space for security, safety, autonomy, the things that we think about as tied to freedom, and not necessarily doing it in the context of the Manumission Act. So a lot of the book is about the ways that intimacy and kinship become these mechanisms, these strategies, these practices that women of African descent engage in order to secure manumission, but it does not stop there. I argue that one of the things that's very, very important to understanding how we think about Black women's lives broadly in this period is that their lives and their understanding of freedom couldn't be limited to manumission acts or emancipation decrees. So even as they are securing allies who can help them purchase their freedom, they're creating kinship ties that can help them navigate their ways out of bondage. They're also imagining freedom that is well beyond that. And one of the ways I'm able to do this is I begin with a focus on Senegambia, in particular the Comptoirs of Saint Louis and Gorée on the West African coast, and the ways that African women, free as well as enslaved, are navigating their in some ways, middle status, but also the power that they have as cultural brokers and commercial brokers between the French and the policies are further on the countryside. In this context, we're talking about Senegambia, so we're talking about the Wolof, we're talking about Catholic and Muslim entities, we're talking about various understandings of gender, but also, for the most part, a kind of hegemony of patriarchy in which women are beholden to uncles, fathers, husbands in ways that still put them at a kind of place of risk and precarity and not, depending on how you think about it, not quite subordinate status, but not with the same kind of power that men have in this world. And so it looks at the ways that free African women, through slave ownership, through being tastemakers, in other words, cultivating commercial, a circulation of commercial goods, particularly European goods, around the coast that are become markers of status, by managing labor at the two comptoirs. So making demands about having their enslaved people or their captives or having their dependents employed by trading companies, that there are very concrete ways that free African women did what they could to kind of create space for their own autonomy and their own acquisition of goods and their own elevation of status. And that also came with its own kinds of violences. They owned slaves and also were part of a complex of slaving that spread across the Atlantic coast. And so the first half of the book focuses very much on that. It focuses on the kinship networks that they create through their baptismal practices, through their navigation of Mariage à la Modupe, which was a marriage custom that emerges on the coast that fuses Catholic and Wolof traditions, and the kind of self-conscious choices they make to create their own space for safety and security and autonomy, these practices of freedom. And then it moves across the Atlantic so that we can think about the ways that a kind of parallel but different world is happening along the Gulf Coast as enslaved women, children, and men are funneled onto slave ships and moved to perform labor in the Caribbean and along the Gulf Coast, Louisiana. And so it looks at the ways that these vectors of intimacy, of kinship, these practices, as well as the ways that the French are thinking about Black women as licentious, Black women as problematic, as parasites, as trying to secure freedom, manumission acts in this case, through manipulating white men's desires, that all of these things are also circulating. So it begins to look at the ways that in a milieu that's also part of, excuse me, a milieu that's also part of this expanding slaving complex, excuse me, and a milieu that's also part of this expanding slaving contest, that African women now on the other side of the Atlantic also have to find ways to expand their idea of freedom and to enact freedom practices. And so it moves through those strategies and the lives that they're able to build and create on the American side of the Atlantic. It also, again, looks at baptism, but also looks at manumission acts and the acquisition of freedom. But it also looks at what are the other ways that Black women are creating practices that help them sustain themselves, that help them sustain their kin. So it looks at spaces of pleasure, it looks at dance, it looks at feasts, it looks at the ways that Black women show up to defend each other, even in the face of literal violence, life-threatening attacks. And it looks at how that also in and of itself changes. I mean, I think one of the key pieces that I want to stress in this era is that we cannot come to the 18th century with an idea of what slavery is in stasis. This is a moment, this is a whole century in which slavery, race, Blackness, gender, all of these things have a history and they have their own historical arc and process. And so even as you have the emergence of ideas of what a negress is, what a mulatresse is, you also have that changing, and you have it changing in the New Orleans context when the Spanish arrived. So I talk about the ways that the shift to Spanish Empire not just creates some new ideas of race in the introduction of the casta system, but you also have new mechanisms for securing freedom. And that changes the understandings of what freedom is and its possibilities. into the second half of the 18th century. The book ends with a quick look at the acquisition of Louisiana by the United States, and especially the migration of Haitian Saint-Domingue emigres expelled from Cuba who arrive in New Orleans, and looks at that to say that a lot of ways our picture of New Orleans, and particularly its free community of color, is often a kind of image that we have from that 19th century moment. It's a moment after the Saint-Domingue migration. It's a moment in which there's a kind of mythology about who the free woman of color is. There's a kind of mythology of what the free community of color is and is doing. And in reality, it's actually much more complicated. There's a long century of freedom practices, of African arrivals, of ways of thinking about community, intimacy, kinship, womanhood, all of these that comes before this American moment and the Jean de Couleur Libre. And how can we begin to think about this longer century of Black life and diasporic life in the region in the same context that we're thinking about the American moment. So I'll stop there. The last thing I will say is that so much of this book is very much tries very much to be accountable to Black women's lives and Black women's history of New Orleans, Black feminist thought, Black artists, Black women artists in particular. The cover is by Lolita Martin, who's a Black woman printmaker of the South. The poetry that begins the introduction is Ray Paris, who is a Black woman poet who is out of New Orleans diaspora. So there are ways that the citational practice tries very much to root itself in the ways that Black womanhood and ideas about Black womanhood have their own theorization of what slavery meant and what happened in this moment of bondage. And I hope that as people are reading it, that can become clear, and that kind of accountability can be part of their reading practice.
Thank you so much. So we're now going to have Professor Block respond.
Thank you. Everyone can hear me, hopefully. I'm honored to be here alongside Doctors Johnson, Turner, and Cooper Owens. I thought today I'd talk broadly about how Wicked Flesh challenges traditional methodologies as a means to harness the power of history, and touch on some of the points that Dr. Johnson just ended with. So as she said, Wicked Flesh travels a broad chronologic and geographic path, revealing a world made by and for African women and women of African descent in the era of the Atlantic slave trade. Women's intimate and kinship relationships really do take center stage in stories of slavery, power, freedom, and daily life. Tracing the quotidian practices that helped women create freedom by, in Dr. Johnson's words, securing their bodies, defending their mobility, and protecting their legacies in the face of the perpetual insecurity that would attend slavery, Blackness, race, and resistance in the New World is a monumental achievement. Dr. Johnson employs sources and methods to counteract historical practices that have marginalized too many people. She revisualizes the perspectives of those who did not leave or did not control traditional written records. I encourage anyone interested in theoretical and historical approaches to the African diaspora, the Atlantic world, sexuality, women, or archival critique. Honestly, set aside an entire day to explore the endnotes alone. They are an intellectual delight. Dr. Johnson, as she said, sees herself writing in honor of the mothers and daughters of New Orleans, and explicitly situates this as a methodological innovation. She straightforwardly rejects historians who are bound by archives that have been structured to erase Black women. As she clearly states, this is not the intellectual tradition this book was written in. Using language that evokes her considerable expertise in digital humanities, Dr. Johnson argues that to surface silence in the imperial archive as having a value, a null value, imbues absence with disruption and possibility. By pointing to the responsibility to question, not just uncover, what evidence is and what evidence does, Dr. Johnson overturns the idea that historians stand apart from their own understandings of knowledge making. Wicked Flesh's expanded methodological approach shifts the reader's gaze from global processes to the intimacies of individuals' lives. Dr. Johnson foregrounds the life stories of numerous women, no easy feat for this time period. Readers learn about Pelagia Perrine Dauphine and Senora Caddy, Marie Baud and Maria Theresa, and many more. Each woman appears with a story of her efforts to create freedom, her pain and struggle, and the way she worked at stealing a bit of sweetness for herself. Starting a chapter with the statement, quote, "In May 1751, Charlotte asked to speak to the governor's wife," or noting that Carlotta practiced her freedom aggressively, reinforces that this is a book about women's actions, efforts, desires, and goals. Dr. Johnson successfully brings women's plausible perspectives to life as they practice freedom even when they could not call themselves free. I also want to note the way that her evocative writing, such as that enslaved people's homes were never more than a muddy stroll away from commercial activity, allows readers to see individuals instead of the totalizing category of slaves or Black women, even as they had to negotiate a world structured by violent racism and colonialism. Johnson's conceptualization of freedom allows her to reconsider women's pain and pleasure as she writes them into three-dimensional complexity. So Wicked Flesh really encouraged me to think about how the way we write distant history changes when we stop thinking of the past as past. Dr. Johnson productively promotes a re-entanglement of past and present by acknowledging her scholarship's debts to the modern era. The book's dedication includes To New Orleans Before the Storm and the names of 4 deceased scholars, including the African-American women's historian, the late Stephanie Camp. This conveys both the accomplishments and pain that continue to the present day. As she said, the introduction credits Ray Paris's The Forgetting Tree, a rememory for its title, and Paris credits her own title to Toni Morrison's Beloved. Such links emphasize the centrality of the broad intellectual work done by communities of women of African descent in producing an ethical history of the Atlantic world. In The Forgetting Tree, Paris aims to interrogate, quote, what we build monuments to, the fictions we tell about our not so distant, troubled yesterday, and how these fictions inform and shape our violent present. Dr. Johnson's Wicked Flesh aptly answers this challenge by showing how nation-based chronological cause and effect narratives wrongly impose a singular order on the threads of history, too often reinscribing white supremacist and settler colonial perspectives. By attending to the webs of community across time and beyond the strictures of conventional professionalized definitions of research and scholarship, Dr. Johnson is able to write a history of building up and tearing down, of dispossession and persistence, of suffering and sweetness. Doing so shares stories of those who did not get to write their own narratives and manifests the many ways that African women and women of African descent nevertheless created their own histories. Thanks.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Professor Turner.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me begin by thanking Dr. Cooper Owens and her staff at the Library Company of Philadelphia for bringing us all together, despite being in the middle of the pandemic. It's wonderful to be able to connect with scholars who are all the way on the other side of the continent. And also, despite the fact that Dr. Johnson and I are in the same department, we actually don't get to meet in this fashion very often. We rarely get such opportunities. So it's very wonderful to be here. And of course, all thanks goes to Dr. Johnson for writing this wonderful book that makes such incisive intervention into the field. So I'm very thrilled to be able to participate in this conversation. So my approach is very different than Dr. Block's, which is I sort of I have a series of questions because I don't want to steal Dr. Johnson's thunder. I think it would be wonderful to hear from her to sort of tease out some of the elements of the book, some of the moments where I think she's sort of making a critical intervention in the field. One of the strengths of the work, I think, is sort of its evocative nature, and Dr. Block sort of talks about this, giving us a teaser of the kind of language, the vivid language Dr. Johnson uses. And, you know, the work sort of invites us to rethink broadly the history of slavery and the history of Black women. I think she sets this up very early in the text on page 2, where she sort of explains that, you know, what she's hoping to do is to explore the multiplicities of women's freedom struggle. That very clearly, as she stated in her introduction, that this is not simply thinking of women's struggle with juridical freedom. It's women sort of seeking and gaining freedom in the interstices of slavery. I think sort of cautioning against viewing manumission as the route to freedom, and rightly insisting that women found diverse and inventive ways of securing freedom, even when they couldn't necessarily call themselves free, is quite provocative. And just sort of thinking through one of the critical lines. So one of the things that I appreciate about the book is that it gives us so many moments where she gives us this wonderful sentence that makes you pause and really just rethink what you thought you understood about the history of slavery and the history of women. And one of this moment comes very early on in the text on page 2, where Dr. Johnson writes, "Free people of African descent became the remainder of an unresolvable equation created by the mathematics of transforming human beings into chattel property." Just the elegance and beauty of that sentence. There's a whole world captured within that sentence that scholars have struggled with, the equation and the mathematics of transmuting humans into property. And so I wondered if Dr. Johnson could sort of walk us through this equation, the mathematics of transforming humans into property, but also its resolvableness. So historians talk about this mathematics, but can you talk about the unresolvableness and whether it's the freedom that women were able to secure that made this equation unresolvable? And was this equation closed for enslaved people? And I guess the sort of question is emerging because the freed people are being singled out here as the reason the equation becomes unresolvable. So in essence, another way of framing it is, does the equation then become solvable for the enslaved and only unsolvable when we're thinking about the enslaved? So I'd love to sort of hear Dr. Johnson talk about that. So I have a couple of questions and I wanted to be a little bit conversational, and just so that I sort of don't take too much time, I'll pause there and allow Dr. Johnson to be able to respond, and then I'll come back with my additional sort of comment and question that are intertwined, because I want to talk to you.
Okay, so can everybody hear me? Hear me okay? Excellent. So I love this question. Oh my gosh. So first of all, thank you both for these comments, these questions, these provocations, and for reading so deeply and with care into the work. I can only hope that the work is read deeply in the same way by others, and that's a gift, I guess, is what I'm saying. Like in a world in which like our attention is, I think Alexis Pauline Gumbs says, our attention is our wealth, you know, and it's distracted in all these ways. To be read deeply is absolutely a gift of generosity. So thank you. To take up Dr. Turner's point about this math of slavery, of bondage. And I want to say, of course, that, you know, one of the ways that I'm thinking about the kind of mathematics of the plantation, mathematics of this is through and with Catherine McKittrick's really iconic essay about the mathematics of Black life. Because I think there's ways that, like, as somebody who is has been interested in studying the history of slavery for so long, and in particular interested in how we talk about and how we think about and write histories of free people of color, there is a kind of strange math that has been applied to them. There's been a way of thinking about free people of color as this in-between, as though they somehow don't add up to what, the slave as this demoted chattel, socially, natally dead, alienated status. And then there's the non-slave, the free person that is often figured as white. That is the citizen, the patriot, the person who is free. And then free people of color is this kind of, extra phrasing that is set apart. And I think scholars have not always known what to do with them, with that category. And in a lot of ways, I came to writing this book years and years ago, to looking at New Orleans because of the ways that it never.
Jessica, your voice went out. Jessica? Take out your earbuds. Perhaps we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Then it's gonna make this look weird. All right, so good thing we're all on Spotlight. So, all right, so this is why you have many devices and many redundancies, because it's COVID time and we know how these things go. All right, so yeah, so the historiography is often not known what to do with New Orleans. And part of that is because of the history of free people of color, because of the ways that free women of color have been betrayed, and because of how we think of freedom. Like we think of freedom, particularly during slavery, and free people of color as being this kind of in-between status, or freedom during bondage, manumission during bondage being offered as a kind of escape hatch, which is the actual language that has been used by scholars in the past. They're neither slave nor free. That's the title of the iconic collection that was based off of a conference that's Jack Green, if I'm not mistaken. So there are these ways that free people of color has sort of fallen out of the bottom, and I think that is about the there's an echo. I believe that falling out of the bottom is about the ways that got it. It's about the ways that we have seen slave and free as these full binaries. Like there's no reconciling either one or the other. And I think if we step back from seeing freedom as this status that is somehow removed from the violences and vestiges of slavery, and if we understood enslaved people as having and enacting practices of freedom, even within this plantation context, even within slavery, we can begin to kind of, play with this math a little bit differently. I think also there's ways that we think about, the reason we're thinking about, slavery and freedom, African and European, is having this kind of hard binaries, because that's how Europeans wanted us to think about it. That's how they wrote the documents. That's how they created census documents, slave ship registers, exchange economies and commodities that could be broken down into these like binomial figures, so that when you have Père talking about the pièce d'Inde as the currency in which an enslaved person adds up to, it's a whole cartwheels of logic in order to make one pièce d'Inde equal an enslaved man, or 8 to 35 years old, able-bodied, has all his digits, all of these, a whole list of things, and everything beyond that is a fraction. So by that math, no matter what, to be an enslaved woman, to be a Black woman in this figuration, is to not be even a whole measure of currency. And so there's ways that if we buck the logic of this from the beginning, we can see more spaces of freedom. And we do, as I think Dr. Turner is suggesting, begin to see the ways that both the totality of being an enslaved person, of being chattel, and the that kind of hard boundary around who gets to be free being like a citizen and white in this world. A lot of that does hinge on gender, and a lot of that does hinge on what position is African women are being placed. How is their sexuality being positioned? Where are they placed as far as being seen as licentious, particularly in relation to white women? What are the ways that their reproduction is harnessed to be part of the mechanisms and the labor and the production of slaveholding empires? I love this idea of turning this around and thinking about, actually, it's not unresolvable, that enslaved people had the key and had the map from the beginning, and there's a way to think about that as kind of a secret path or a secret codex that enslaved people had to unlock the ways of being human in this world. And I would love to think with that even more, and to expand on that even more, because if that is a space where we can begin to think productively about Black life in slavery's archive, I want to go there. I want to live and work there. Apologies for all the sound issues. Hopefully it sounds better.
It sounds much better. Sasha, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So, I think you've sort of brought to the fore what I'm sort of seeing as a tension that gets woven throughout the book. So there, as you're rightly saying, there is sort of this tension between the free and the enslaved, the binary that's emerging, and you sort of have this insecure middle ground that free people are occupying, and scholars often don't know what to do with them because they're sort of not fitted neatly within either or of these categories. But beyond sort of these binaries that you've mentioned, the sort of tension between free and slave, I think another one of the strengths of the work is that it's sort of bringing to the surface other kinds of tension. One of the tensions, I think, is sort of the tension between kinship and family, the tension between biological and social ties among these different groups who are sort of, striving towards free. And I think one of the tensions that sort of really stood out for me to sort of connect back to the earlier point is sort of this tension between dehumanization and commodification. And I think there's this really great moment in the text where you're sort of channeling Walter Johnson, where he sort of makes a very bold statement and said, slavery did not dehumanize the enslaved, right? And your sort of claim is that the reality was much worse, because what's actually happening is that slave traders, the planters, they all depended on the ever-present humanity of their slaves, so that in your language, the atrocities that they visited upon them would matter. So the fact that the enslaved fear, this actually meant that they could be controlled. So you're actually pushing back and saying, wait a minute, let's look at this whole idea of the dehumanization of the enslaved. But at the same time, the tension that's coming out, just like that tension between the slave and the free, is that we're learning too that enslavement turned people into commodities, essentially. And this is sort of Stephanie Camp being echoing, and I noticed Dr. Cooper Owens is sort of given the bibliography in the chat. So I think we could sort of reference Walter Johnson and yes. Stephanie Camp, Stephanie Smallwood's Saltwater Slavery as well for our audience. But I'm sort of hearing Stephanie Smallwood coming out here, and there's a quotation too in the text where this process, again, to go back to the mathematics, Stephanie Smallwood sort of explains that, this process of turning captives into commodities, where people are being reduced to the sum of their biological parts, thereby scaling down life to an arithmetical equation and finding the lowest common denominator. So it seems to me, on the one hand, what's coming out in the work is that, in addition to sort of that binary tension between slave and free, there's also this tension between commodification on the one hand and dehumanization on the other. So we're sort of seeing this argument that slavery obliterated the humanity such that people are turned into commodity, but at the same time, the humanity sort of is still there. So is this a question of the rhetoric of the dehumanization of the enslaved that sort of finds its way still, even when you're trying to disentangle these two very tightly woven contexts? So I just wanted to hear you sort of think out loud about that tension on the one hand between the dehumanization of the enslaved through the process of commodification, and then you're sort of pushing back and saying, actually, no, they were not quite dehumanized because slavery actually depended on the humanity of the enslaved. So to sort of, you know, think through that tension that your work is bringing up so well for us.
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the, I mean, I want to make sure that I am citational here. There is scholar Sharon with Slavery at Sea, who has done such amazing work on the Middle Passage. There is Stephanie Smallwood, as you mentioned. There's Stephanie Camp, whose work on you know, the rival geography and geography of containment is so crucial. But here, you know, and I think you're picking up on some of what I was grappling with, particularly in that slave trade chapter. Her work on the three bodies of the enslaved is incredibly instructive to me here, because I think one of the parts about dehumanization and commodification, one of the key pieces there, for me, her concept of three bodies. So three bodies are, you know, a body that experiences terror, a body that labors, and a body that experiences pleasure. And I remember being on a panel in honor of her memory at, I think it was AHA or OAH, and Dr. Barbara Kruthamer saying there's an important piece there that Stephanie Camp says at least three bodies, not just three. And I think there's this importance for us to keep in mind. So and the last person I want to mention when I'm thinking of these things is Simone Brown, whose work on the kind of material life of surveillance during this period, the creating of documentation and creating of logics of currency, of transport, of commerce that, you know, help that require something like a pièce d'âne, some kind of like stable unit of analysis in order to trade in this new commodity of human flesh, but also then creates all this material that codifies that and that makes that now not just a novel idea or novel creation, but now the logic of Blackness in this world. So, but this concept of the three bodies, I think is incredibly instructive, incredibly helpful for how we're thinking about exactly that dyad of dehumanization and commodification. Because I do think both are happening. Or I think that the commodification is happening, but that is not the sum total of how enslaved people understood their lives as commodities. Although that's actually part of their calculations. When and I talk about this a little bit later in the chapter with the Spanish period, where you can kind of get an assessment of your own value in order to secure a Carta de Libertad, a manumission document that has like your price essentially, so you can basically pay down your own price. So it's not so. Even though enslaved people are not thinking of themselves as I am, you know, now sheep to be sold, they do have a sense of their own valuation. And that's a thing that emerges later in the 18th century in this period. So there's commodification and there's how Europeans wish enslaved people operated. And then there's how enslaved people operate and even turn that upside down on their own. And then there's that question that you know, afflicts us as scholars of slavery, like how do we think of dehumanization? How do we understand like the immense violence, the properties of that violence in people's lives? And I do, like, I think I cite Dr. Walter Johnson's work in this text, in that, you know, there is something in how the trade happens, in the terror that is required to manage enslaved populations, that requires enslaved humanities, requires a recognition that they experience fear and terror, requires a recognition, as corrupted as it is, of sexual acts, of the twisted nature of rape and violence. And we have Dr. Block here, who's like, has one, the iconic history of rape and coercion in early America. And so there was something about that that's really important. And what I wanted to do, I wanted that to be absolutely part of the story. I mean, that's the wicked part of Wicked Flesh. And it's also informed by Horton Spiller's work, the iconic essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, but Horton Spiller's large oeuvre around thinking about what is the work that Black womanhood is doing for the modern world, essentially, in all of its capacities. But that Wicked piece, I think, was really, really important, because the way that enslaved people are being funneled into the slave trade, they're seen as these fractions of, you know, a laboring body, or kind of this imagined plantation body, but they're not being talked about that way. They're not being treated that way. There's instructions about do not rape the women, do not allow the women to be debauched on the slave ships. They're being talked about as beautiful, as belle, as so dark, and lovely, dark and lovely, as smart, as, you know, wonderful domestics. They will be, you know, in beautiful service to you. Specifically, the Wolof are being talked about this way. They're being kidnapped in a capacity of acquisition for labor, but also acquisition for reproductive labor. So there's something more than the laboring body, the laboring plantation body, that is happening in this trade that is making African women, Black women in particular, attractive, and giving them a valuation that is not just a piasta on. And we have not quite tackled that like we need to when we're studying the slave trade. We have not quite tackled that like we need to when we're studying plantations and slavery. I think that a lot of that is sort of like a kind of very male hegemony over how we talk about labor, how we talk about plantation valuations. Diana Remy Berry's first book, Swing the Sickle, is very much about challenging this idea of skilled labor as this domain of men primarily, and that there are women, like this is antebellum Georgia, I believe. There are women who are also valued quite highly. Ed Baptist's iconic essay on the fancy trade, we don't talk about that enough. So we don't talk about sexuality having a value, essentially. And for me, and it's clearest, I think, when I try and talk about in the slave trade chapter, but throughout, the way that French are thinking about the kind of corrupted sexuality of African women, it actually has a value to them. And how can we bring that into how we think about the violence that is happening? I think dehumanization too often becomes a kind of shorthand for talking about violence, as opposed to actually talking about and thinking through violence and terror, as hard as it is, and thinking through what that actually meant for enslaved people in their actual lives, and not thinking only of how Europeans are understanding what role Africans should play in the world that they've imagined in their head that even does not even play out in the real world. But I would love to hear Dr. Black talk about coercion and sexual violence, because I know that like so much of your work is so important here.
Thank you. That is so kind. I wasn't going to talk about that, but let me think, and maybe I will. But I wanted to pick up, I was just so entranced with what you were saying, and the two of you, kind of the problematic trying to work through this. And I completely agree with you on the dehumanization, right? It's kind of a cop-out, right? Because it doesn't force us to get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. And I am old enough to remember far too many years when Jennifer Morgan's book was the only book on Black women in North America in the Atlantic world in this period, far too many years. So for me, there is also a joy in seeing the work of all of you, right? That this is the vibrancy of this field. And so I have a couple connected questions. One, I mean, what you said about not just the impression of the labor of enslaved men, but the degree to which you are making interventions in a field that has written about men, and I think of you both in digital humanities, and there's a certain sort of track of studies of enslaved people, or studies of the slave trade that moves in very different directions from the kind of work you're doing. So that was sort of one thing, but I also wanted to ask if you wanted, how you saw Jennifer Morgan's recent work in Small Acts that is talking about Black women as political theorists, as the first political theorists of race. And it strikes me that you are not using the language of politics, but trying to address the same kind of problematic and come to a resolution. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, my only thoughts are to stand, because it's such amazing work. It's such amazing work, and yes, I'm so excited about the new project and the book to come, which I think is I think I've already pre-ordered it, but I do think, and it's funny. So yeah, so I did not necessarily talk about the women in this text as political theorists. I do, and I did mean to talk about them as intellectuals, as their scholars of their own life. And so in this, I was thinking, especially with Michael Gomez, Exchanging Our Country Marks, iconic book, has a chapter called Tad's Query, in which he talks about the ways that in the antebellum South, enslaved people, Black people, had their own critique of slavery and of the slaveholding regime. And it came out in folklore. It came out in stories of betrayal by their own people, et cetera, but like they had, like, we don't have to agree with it, but they had their own ideas of how we got here. And that in some ways is one of the questions that I think I wanted to make sure that we understood. African women of African descent have their own answers to that. Like, we don't have to be the only ones answering that. So very much to me is thinking about, like, how can we think of enslaved women, enslaved people, as being part of this longer intellectual history about what it means to be Black in a new world, what it means to be African American, these big questions that have guided our field for so long. But I think that I could also say, and I would also hope that the book and the women in the book are seen also as political theorists. I absolutely think they are thinking about politics. I think it's most obvious in some ways on the Senegambian side, where you have free African women sort of navigating these huge geopolitics between Europeans and Wolof entities. But I think you could also say the same thing about, the women who are securing freedom or practicing freedom on the American side. Like one of my favorite quotes by one of them, Marie Charlotte, is where she essentially sues or petitions to get her freedom from a succession, an inheritance. She was gifted free essentially by her owner when they passed, and after suing, she sues for back wages for being forced to be enslaved, even though she's supposed to be free, and says it's not right that a person should be remain a slave because of a trick. And that to me is like, there's so much of a critique there. Like, slavery is a trick to these women, and they understand the trick. They're not, and that to me also is a talk back to this idea of dehumanization. If we're talking about it in a kind of totalizing sense of Africans arrived and they just, were stuck as slaves. I'm like, no, they know that there's something wrong here. And they pass on that knowledge and they pass on that realization to their children and to generations, and they gift legacies of freedom. As soon as they can in the Spanish era, they're securing freedom. They're securing, they're purchasing themselves. They're writing into their testaments freedom and gifts and legacies of freedom to each other. And so for them, there's no confusion about what this state is. And the way we talk about slavery, though, is, I think sometimes does not give that kind of space for that creativity and that critique and that talk back.
All right, we only have a few more minutes before we open up the Q&A, but did you all want to respond to that? Or if I can, I know I'm moderating, but I was really curious about this. And for those who haven't read your book, explain to us Wicked Flesh. Like, immediately I was in kind of preparation, I talked to Professor Turner almost every day, and I was like, I want to talk about corporeality. I want to talk about, this like wicked flesh, and really have us think about what you mean when you name a book that's about Black women and Black women in slavery. So can you talk a little bit about that as well, unless you wanted to address what Professors Block or Turner asked you earlier?
No, I can totally talk about that. So, so Wicked Flesh, as I mentioned, the concept of the flesh very much comes from Horton Spiller's essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. And in that essay, she talks about the ways that the slave trade, slavery, the creation of this new world society based on bondage was created in part by reducing people, not just to genders and to commodities, but into bodies, but even beyond that, into flesh. So flesh is a formation that precedes gender, that precedes body, that is part of the ungendering of Africans in this instance, that facilitates the commodification, as we were talking about, that allows that logic to make sense to people. So in a kind of material way, in order for it to make sense, for something like a piasta an to exist, Europeans had to fundamentally think differently about who was being placed on ships around them, had to do, and then part of that mental cartwheel, Horton Spiller's names as flesh. I will say that this is my understanding of Spiller. Spiller's work is the kind of work that you come to over and over again. And I've come to it over and over again and have a different understanding of it in some ways each time, but this is one thing that's sort of held strong. So hopefully Dr. Spillers that is doing the work, at least some justice and some good summary. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with the book was absolutely pay tribute to that, because I think that transition from free African to enslaved person on the other side of the Atlantic, that transition is embodied in one of the women who crosses, Maribo, who goes from a free African woman, slaveholder, to, in a lot of ways, a kind of unnamed wife of a European artisan in the Americas. Her journey encapsulates so much of that. Like, she goes from somebody who is has all of these significant social, political status ties on one side, and moves through an archive, the slave ship archive, to Louisiana's archive, and then reappears as you know, like as a Madame Binet, and that's it. And then being a free wife as a African in a slaveholding society is certainly something distinctive, and she certainly jumps out to anybody who's looked at that archive. But it's not the same thing as being Maribo in Saint Louis and Corée. And so there was something about this transition back and forth that becomes really, really important in understanding what Black women are up against in keeping themselves. And so that flesh piece became really important to make sure that's highlighted. And the Wicked piece is part of how that flesh happened. So in the French Atlantic, and this became then really specific to how discourses around sex, around intimacy, are so much tied with control of resources. So on the Senegambian side, the French are explicitly concerned about the ways that the habitants, and many of them African women, are controlling resources, property, access to subsistence good, access to trade, access to labor, access to the slaves in their home. Like, they have a kind of power, essentially, that is frustrating, endlessly frustrating to the governors and the company directors on that side. And they're called everything: licentious, parasites, wicked, over and over and over. And on the other side of the Atlantic, and this is a kind of interpolation with what's happening in the metropole, as like the 1685 Code Noir is established, the 1724 Code Noir in Louisiana is established. On the other side of the Atlantic, you have a similar frustration, but over the terms of manumission, because it's not immediate that you have a kind of, you know, status follows the mother circumstance. And even in the two Code Noirs, 1685 and 1724, you have differing terms upon which enslaved people could secure their freedom if they had to. Those terms come about out of a frustration that's articulated as frustration with what African women are doing sexually to secure freedom from, you know, these unwilling and oh, you know, woe is this white man who fell, you know, under the spell of these negresses. And so that question of wickedness is really critical here to how this formulation of flesh gets created. But this question of wickedness, I wanted to also kind of do like a trick on it, because the wicked, they're only wicked when they are not being subservient. They're only wicked when they're not being slaves. They're wicked when they're practicing freedom, literally. And so that's how the title of this book came about. And it was, my editor was super enthusiastic about the title. I went through many, many titles sort of in my head, trying to think about how to capture the kind of defiance and essence, and also the creativity and possibility. And Wicked Flesh was able to do that, but also pay tribute to Horton Spillers and her iconic theorization of this moment.
Okay, so it was actually perfect timing. I am going to open this up, and please feel free, every last one of you, to, if there's something that pops out, feel free to join in. But I'm going to ask a question. Stephanie Narrow, who's one of our attendees, asks, thanks to all for this wonderful discussion. This conversation on the mathematics and commodification of the enslaved reminds me of your other work on digital humanities, especially how this turn to the digital also replicates the traumas of slavery in the present day when we relegate human lives to data points. How do we navigate this tension, as echoed by Dr. Turner's comments, and honor the humanity of our historical subjects as more of our scholarly work moves into various digital platforms?
Yes, this is a question that very much preoccupies me, especially of late. It is a question in which a lot of my second book project is going to be thinking through and working on. And I think that tension is exactly right. There's so much that is translated from these documents faithfully into like a digital sphere. And that means that we're transferring that violence the documents are created in. And so what are the ways that we can be attuned to? One of the first steps is being attuned to that. The kind of, and for those who do digital humanities, we know that actually is a first step. Unfortunately, there's a way that kind of coming to digital databases, data, algorithms, that these things in a world of tech and STEM can sometimes be seen as like, no, these are just stable, or they're neutral, or they have no history that is violent, or the history of violence is past, because now we have a kind of stable unit of analysis in order to investigate, these questions. So actually, for digital humanists, computer scientists, data computational scholars, a lot of the first step is actually just reckoning with this material is not neutral in any kind of way. And the next is to find ways to trouble our data and trouble our projects. And so when I talk about it, I talk about the ways that how are the projects that we create collaborating beyond the project team, in whether it's in the community, or if so with the project that I direct an initiative called Life Code, Digital Humanities Against Enclosure. And one of the projects is Keywords for Black Louisiana. One of the things that we are talking about are what are the ways that what the kinds of projects we're creating, how are those accountable to Black Louisiana, to Black New Orleans? What are the ways that we're going to remain in conversation with live people who for whom this history is actually quite intimate? So I think that that's something that we don't talk about, and how we draft our projects, how we map out our projects. That has to be part of the analysis. Color Conventions Project does this amazing. AdHum, African American Digital Humanities Initiative at University of Maryland does this amazing. We can actually create ethics documents that say, this is how we should use data, or this is what we want to be accountable to. But I think also some of it is just, being okay with bucking against the assumptions that we have about the digital, or about technology, that it is okay if things don't add up correctly. That actually may tell us something really important about the data that we have, or what we're trying to do with it. It may be okay that, we cannot replicate a data set. It may be okay that, that we are not creating these kind of big data projects, that there is data missing. How do we talk about that missing data? The null value is a concept that's part of Wicked Flesh that is trying to kind of ask us to think differently about these silences that are in these census registers, but that also comes from the digital humanities as a way to capture the irreconcilability of certain values and formulas. So I think we have to be okay with breaking things, and we also have to be very cognizant of the things that we create as having more layers than just here is a database that is the exact facsimile of the slave ship register. And there are projects like I mentioned, like that I think do this really well, but not enough. And there's so many layers. But again, like I think Dr. Block, I'm looking at my computer screen on this side. Dr. Block, I would love to hear, because you're doing this also, I believe, with like I'm100 with some other folks.
Yeah, no, I will add to that. And I will say, I think we forgot to mention, especially when you're talking about silences, and this gets back to sexuality, I think Marisa Fuentes' work is another citational practice that has been foundational for many people in thinking about the silence and being able to build on that to do the kind of work you're doing. I was just going to say, I find some of the really important work being done in this area, not by historians. If people, the film Coded Bias, I don't know if people have seen it, but it is fantastic and it's not, you can see it various places online. It is brilliant about the kinds of biases that are built into even things like facial recognition software. It follows a bunch of Black women who are really trying to shake up, one of whom got fired from Google recently, separate story, in AI work. Also Sophia Noble's work. Gosh, I'm blanking on the title of her book.
Algorithms of Oppression.
Thank you, Algorithms of Oppression, best title ever. That kind of work is really trying to get at this. And certainly my own too, thinking about, we all use JSTOR, those of us who are historians, as a scholarly database. It makes its money, even as a nonprofit, off our work, and yet its classifications and keywords to our work and search capabilities to our work are really profoundly racist and sexist. And what do we do about that? Like it is, the algorithms are preventing the finding and connecting of certain kinds of scholarship because they are using traditional kinds of databases to catalog and categorize, which ironically kind of gets back to, right, the women that you were talking about, right? From the very beginning, there are huge stakes in the ability to name, categorize, and set into separate identities and sections. And I think there is a continuation that is going on today. We see that in digital humanities. So that was my few thoughts on that. Great question.
Okay. I want to ask another question for someone in the audience. Thanks so much for this rich discussion, Professor Johnson. Might you elaborate on Black femme freedom in relation to the title of your book?
Absolutely. So Black femme freedom is a way of naming and a formulation that I talk about in chapter 5. One of the things that I wanted to make sure was really clear in this history, well, two of the things. One of the things I wanted to make sure was really clear in this history was what would it mean to write about gender, about Black womanhood, less so Black girlhood, although Charlotte would count, I think, as sort of a vestige of Black girlhood, without assuming a gender binary, without assuming gender. And I do that, I think I'm most clear about that or if I'm successful at all, it's most successful maybe in that slave trade chapter and the language used there. But I really wanted to kind of press into, not presuming that we actually know what the gender binary is or how it operates, one, and two, not presuming that we have an idea of gender that we can just either take across the Atlantic from one side to the other, or that remains in stasis. That idea that Black womanhood has a history, I think, is a thing that we do not talk about enough. We do not think about womanhood itself and what that means as having a kind of processing point from A to B, maybe from B back to A to whatever way we want to think of time as linear or circular or generational, what it means to be a woman is not going to be the same at any given point in this 18th century. And it's not gonna be the same even for these women. And so Black femme freedom is a way of capturing a moment in which Blackness and what it means to be a woman, that ascription, that femininity, feminist, that it's coalescing into something that will be a moment. That is a kind of tenuous practice of freedom. So not gender as identity or as gender as ascription, but gender as, but femme, not femme as identity, femme as ascription, but femme as a practice, as a radical politic, as a way of, as a thing of naming when women, or those who are understood to be women, come together and will fight for each other, and naming that as radical. Like there is something fundamentally radical in a expressly violent patriarchal society, violently anti-Black society, for Black women to actually come together to, for instance, in one example in this book, defend each other against a soldier. And it comes with like literal, like life-threatening consequences. But it's acts that we don't always remark on as like, that is a significant thing. So Black femme in particular, and Black femme freedom names those practices. It names those practices as fundamental, defiances in the face of the growing, increasingly slaveocracy, plantation, white heteropatriarchal regime. But it also names them as a kind of alternative way of imagining sociality, of imagining kinship. You could say imagining sisterhood. It names practices of women loving each other that can't be, subsumed and consumed by the plantation regime, that are honestly unrecognizable to slaveholding officials because they have no productive value. And in this, I'm thinking with Omezike Tinsley and her work on Black Atlantic, Queer Atlantic, the women loving women, it has no, it is a no value. It can't be computed because it has no, it doesn't have any productive use for slave owners. So it names all of those things, and names the practices that in a moment, create worlds otherwise for, and in worlds otherwise, I'm thinking with Dr. Yamaya Figueroa, worlds otherwise for these women. And it also names a moment that is very different from a kind of Black womanhood that emerges, that is rooted in property, that is rooted in a contract, that has different ideas of kinship, different ideas of who you show up for. And you can see this in this example that I talk about in the story of Magdalena and Fanchon in chapter 6, where Magdalena is upset because Fanchon does not defend her and essentially does not have her back. That's a different kind of trajectory of like this history of Black womanhood. Black femme is very much a queer formation. It very much names women like loving each other, sweetness for each other, sweetness for us. It very much comes out of Black queer culture and understanding of itself as a kind of defiance of the plantocracy. And so Black femme is meant to name and give us a way of like, kind of capturing like the whole radical alternate world building that those kinds of practices actually derive from and could create in other instances, in some alternate timeline, and our sort of vestiges and legacies of how Black femme and Black queer practices and kinships operate today.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. I really love that question. Actually, it's further down on my list of questions that I wanted to bring out, which is, to ask, what is it that Black femme freedom or Black femme does that Black womanhood doesn't do? And I think one of the wonderful things in reading this great volume is I'm sort of reading it, yes, in conversation with Spillers, but also almost as a continuity from where Spillers leaves off, which is, in reading through Spiller, one of the frames that come to mind is that she speaks of the ungendered in sort of a fixed, rigid moment. And I sort of see, weaving through your work, and I don't know if this is deliberate, and I wonder if you could talk about that. There are moments when you're sort of speaking to the ungendered flesh, and then there's the ungendering. And so I'm sort of thinking and wondering if there is something here about how the gerund ing is being used in terms of a linguistic device to sort of lend further plasticity or clarity to the plasticity of the transformation of captives, but also the ways in which these interstitial practices of freedom is also regendering at the very moment that ungendering is taking place, right? And so is it in some cases that there is a failure of language, that language sometimes, you know, we say ungendered, it it can't quite capture the kind of messiness. So, you know, some of the adjectives that I love that you use, the sort of messiness, the kind of stickiness, and there's a stickiness that's sort of woven throughout. And so in a way, I mean, you do sort of echo Spillers, but I think you're doing so much more by, it's not gendered, it's not sort of this closed moment. I think Spillers does make a critical intervention by saying there is something happening here where the language that we currently use, the language of gender that we currently use is not sufficient to capture the messiness, right? And so it's ungendered, but it's not a closed process. I'm sort of thinking with Vincent Brown's work, that essay in AHR, where in this moment of social death, there is social life. A woman dies or a woman is killed, I'm gonna say, but they're ritualizing, they're mourning. This is the moment of social life, even in the moment of social death. So is there sort of a failing of language that makes it difficult for us to fully capture the messiness, your words, the messiness and the stickiness of what these women are experiencing? Or is it perhaps that the categories that we've currently used, ungendered, ungendering, regendering, sort of bends and overlaps so much into each other that we've now sort of spun ourselves into confused circles? And the next sort of scholar that I'm thinking of is Riley Norton, and his use of the transitive. So maybe it's not so much sticking to the ungendered and the gendering, but thinking of trans as inherently having that changeable, you're moving back and forth between flesh and body and flesh again. So could you sort of just talk about, I know I've said a lot here, but you know.
I feel like you said it. No, I mean, that is exactly right. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that, and I think I say it explicitly, if not, I said it in my head a lot, is that, you know, there's not just two genders. This is a world of many genders. And this is a world in which these genders are getting created and recreated and ungendered and regendered over and over and over time. And I do think there is an issue with language. Our language is not yet elastic enough to capture how messy and circular and fluid and the stickiness of this process, all of those things. And I think that is absolutely true. So I think there are ways that, you know, Black femme freedom is a way of creating a kind of umbrella over a moment, a place, because it's also ways that, you know, femme is particular to, you know, like femme means woman in French. So there's ways that it operates as a separation between like also white women in this era and in this moment, and women of African descent. But I do think that, I mean, all of these things I think are at play. And the fact that we're having this conversation, I must say, is so refreshing, but also unusual for slavery scholars, because we often just kind of step into the gender binary because it's there in the plantation register. Like, it's one of the things you can generally count on if it is a kind of distribution of like, male slaves, female slaves, maybe there's a category for children. Like, it's a thing you can find in the register. It's a thing you can find in the database. And it's been presumed so much and into such, codified pieces, like, parts, that we have not stepped back enough to trouble it. And so, yes, I do think we need to like do a lot more troubling of it. We need to do better histories of it. I'm absolutely, very much beholden to Thornton's amazing work and the transitive there. And Black trans studies absolutely is very much part of this, and thinking about how race and gender are, themselves create a gender. And many genders. So I think all of that is very much part of this. But yes, one of my guiding points here in approaching this history is that there's not just one gender. There's not just two genders. There are multiple, and particularly in this moment, they're acting, back and forth on each other. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Kathy Brown, who was doing this, years ago, maybe not naming it as many genders, but was certainly thinking about anxious patriarchs as, I think of that as like as a gender. I'm gonna forget now the other two categories, the wenches and the category that was for white women.
Good wives. You forgot the good wives. And good wives, nasty wenches.
Yeah. So this is all of this needs to be part of it as we get better at bringing Black queer studies and Black trans studies into our history of slavery. We will find that these conversations become even more complex, but even richer. And we will be able to see many more of the layers that create Black womanhood as well. I think, at least.
Could I ask a question that's kind of complete, unless you wanted to go, Sasha? Mine's in a completely different direction, and it's sort of a out in left field question, so sorry. I mean, you've given us so much already to think about. I'll just ask for more. But I've been thinking lately a lot about the interventions that Native American and Indigenous studies scholars have been making, particularly when thinking about responsibilities to modern communities, right? In terms of whose story are we telling, whose history is this? And I found that really productive in terms of thinking about to whom, for whom, and why whom are we writing? And it strikes me that the African diasporic experience, of course, is very different in some ways. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about the communities you write about, the communities you speak to, and how that influences your work.
So it's so funny because I thought, well, I'll do it like this, because I'm glad that you brought Native American and Indigenous studies into this conversation, because actually it's such an important part of this history in this region. It was one of the things that I found when thinking about the African experience, I'll think of like Ireland's classic formation, slave society, society with slaves, like that, move from slave society to society with slaves. It happens, the linchpin of that is the Natchez Revolt, essentially. Excuse me, is the Natchez Revolt. And so we should not, I mean, we probably do too often, but we should not and cannot think about Black life in this region without also thinking about Indigenous nations in this region. And so when I'm thinking about the book and when I was writing about it and focusing on it, it was especially accountable to Black women, but particularly in thinking about how to write that history, one of the kind of, not struggles, but like one of the labors I tried to engage in was how to write this history that was accountable to Black women, but also clear that they are in this world, not just with French women, but also with Indigenous women. And Indigenous women are also enslaved in this world. They are also grappling with a lot of the kind of French preoccupations with métissage and sex across the color line. They are also, you know, part of and caught up in the Natchez War in particular ways. And that means that I then have to talk about Indigenous nation, Natchez, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw. I have to talk about the impact that this war has. And then that meant that I had to actually look at the impact of the Indigenous resistance to the French in a different way. I mean, we talk about, in Louisiana history, we talk about the Natchez War a lot, but when you actually go into the archive, this is a moment, this is like a game-changing moment for the French in this region. So it's not just that it's the fall of a kind of plantation dreams of tobacco in the Natchez region, it's also a changing conception by the French who are there that they have any kind of safety and security themselves, any kind of authority. And as you know, white imperialists do, they act out on all the people of color around them. So they start wars with the Chickasaw as a result, trying to chase down the Natchez. They, Tampere, the governor, sends, he says enslaved men from the outpost at New Orleans to, slaughter a small indigenous nation downriver. Like, they act out in ways that are about terrorizing. And in that terror, we can see the extreme anxiety and insecurity the French have as a result of indigenous resistance. Like, indigenous resistance is that impressive and the French are that much a minority. What's interesting for me there, so if I was I actually took a lot, I wonder if Bob is still here. I actually took a lot of this section out because a lot of it was very much about the Natchez, because I really wanted to make clear the ways that this is native ground, the ways that, Natchez had a stake here, that Natchez don't disappear. There's a lot of the ways we talk about the Natchez wars that, the Natchez are gone. The Natchez don't disappear. They're folded into the creek, and some are deported to Saint-Domingue. So if anybody's interested in doing that work of the Natchez deportees and the indigenous presence in Saint-Domingue enslaved population, there's something there. But I had to return to kind of my compass north, which is accountable to Black women. So what are the ways that what was the Black woman's route through this moment? And so, it meant like thinking in all the different possibilities, right? Like, there are women who are allying with the Natchez or with Choctaw or Chickasaw. There are women who are running away to indigenous nations. There are women who are allying with, enslaved men who are trying to take this moment to revolt. So there's a whole range of aspects here. But I do think there's something there about accountability. There's something there about being really attuned, for those of us who do early America, to the ways that the indigenous are always there and are always actually, like, they're really wrapped up in our story. And that's especially for those of us who do slavery. There's so much that has to be done with Black and indigenous overlapping histories that is increasingly done, I think, more and more, but it should just be sort of, part of our language and part of our talking about it, that we talk about all three. And I don't think we do that just yet. And also, the kinds of accountabilities that Indigenous studies asked us to do. There were accountabilities in that methodology to ecologies, to land, to geography, to nature in ways that I did not, I can't say that I did justice to, but I think can actually be a lead towards, what we're doing with histories of slavery. So I think of J.T. Roan's work on Black ecologies, Tally Goff's work on Black ecologies, Black land practices, either in she's thinking about Jamaica. All of these things are part of, how we can, what the next steps are for this research. So that doesn't quite answer that question, I think, but I'm glad that you brought it into the space, because Indigenous history and study has to be here. Absolutely.
Thank you all so much. I am just pleased that we could have our second Black History Month program during literally, I think the last one was maybe a week ago. So this is wonderful for the program in African American history. I have already sent out a little thank you to our audience. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time for questions, because we have 2 minutes left. And many of us are stressed, really stretched thin during Black History Month. I have a radio program that I have to participate in literally within 15 minutes. But I wanted to just say thank you again to Our author, Jessica Marie Johnson, thank you so much for allowing us to really talk about this wonderful new book you've written. To Professors Sharon Block, who is joining us from the West Coast, to Professor Sasha Turner and her little one who peeked in to also let us know she was interested in the conversation. Thank you to the library company staff, Jasmine Smith, Deja Brock, for your assistance as always. And I thank you to our audience for supporting us. Please check out our website. It's www.librarycompany.org. And you can check out our digital archives. If you have questions, you can always email me or the other panelists. But thank you. Happy Black History Month. And I will see you all at the next program.